Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and this is the Right to Read initiative, where we're spreading information about how best to make sure that our students become readers. Today, I have the pleasure of Nathaniel Hansford joining me again for, is it the fourth time?
I've lost track.
All right. Anyway, today we're talking about vocabulary and the importance of vocabulary instruction. If we go to the Ontario Human Rights Commission's Right to Read public inquiry and the recommendations, we see that it is very important to have vocabulary instruction in our reading instruction to make sure that our students become fluent readers who can comprehend what we're saying. In a conversation earlier with Dr. Stephanie Stoller, she definitely brought out how that vocabulary pillar of reading is prevalent in all of the other pillars of reading development. So today we're going to talk to Nate and look at the research on best practices for vocabulary instruction. Thanks for joining me, Nate. Why don't you give everybody a little background about you and what you do?
Yeah, I'm a grade 8 teacher right now, at least. I mean, I've taught every grade from kindergarten to grade 12. I definitely prefer working with the older kids, if I'm being honest. And I am the main writer for two blogs. That's Pedagogy Non-Grata and Teaching by Science, as well as I co-founded the podcast, Pedagogy Non-Grata. And I am recently the author of the Scientific Principles of Teaching. And I'm coming out with a new book actually this month, but it's not on literacy. It's on math instruction. So clearly I'm terrible at marketing because I'm on a literacy podcast while I'm coming out with a new book on math. Yeah, and I mainly look at education research through the lens of meta-analysis literature. I think it's really important to take a look at it through this lens because there's just so much variability in education studies that it's really hard to know what is true versus what is like theoretical or conjecture. There's all of these claims out there on any side of the debate in education that I feel like aren't necessarily, they might be true and they can definitely be true, but they're not necessarily proven to be true. And I feel like the only way you can really prove it is if we have multiple studies showing the same result. We have to have that replication. And it's really hard to call something scientifically true if we don't have replication on an experimental level. So I think that's actually a little tricky today with today's topic on vocabulary instruction because it's not as clear cut. So last time I came on, I talked about repeated reading. And the time before that, I came on and talked about phonics. That was easy. I felt like I could just slam it out of the park and tell you the evidence is clear cut. We know exactly what we're doing and we know it works. And on vocabulary, I don't feel that way. I feel like it's super muddy and confusing. And maybe you can help me parse this out a little bit because I've looked at the analysis, but I feel like you are much more of an expert on the practical side than I am. So I think it'll be an interesting conversation.
Definitely.
I'm going to share my screen if that's okay.
Of course.
If I can figure out this technology. Remember last time when I tried to get fancy with this and the computer crashed and we had to wait like 5 minutes in the middle of the computer crashing? That was fun. Not at all awkward. Okay. So just starting off, I wanted to talk about what do we mean by vocabulary because when I did a secondary meta-analysis on this recently. I went through the research on it. And I found it wasn't super clear, actually. I think this is the trickiest part because I found that when people say vocabulary, they often mean different things. And that makes it really hard to know what is scientifically proven when people aren't using the same terminology. I think the most common understanding of vocabulary within the scientific literature is the meaning of words. But sometimes people mean fluency of words on single words. And being able to see an individual word and recognize it is a very different thing than knowing the meaning of words. And when we talk about vocabulary instruction, sometimes people are referring to things like teaching the Dolch sight words. And sometimes people are talking about like, I have content quality words in my classroom and I would like my students to know the meaning of them. So I try to address both questions because I think the answer is different for both of them. And I have to ask, can we hear the chainsaw that just started outside my window?
No.
Okay, good. There's a chainsaw going outside my window. It's driving me crazy, actually.
There's also the difference between expressive and receptive vocabulary, right? Are we talking about words that students understand enough when they hear them? Or are we talking about words that they've actually added to their vocabulary and they can use them correctly in speech and understand what they mean in text?
Yeah, and I believe one of the meta-analyses I'm going to talk about today actually looked at that.
Oh, awesome.
So I'm going to look at the first one. And these are just the reading vocabulary meta-analyses that I was able to find.
Can you put it so it's a larger screen by chance?
I could try. Last time we did this, Dr. Kathryn,
I know.
we crashed and it was terribly embarrassing. Let's try. Let's go for it. Let's gamble.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so these are the meta-analyses done on vocabulary, and I want to point out these are actually, with the exception of the element vocabulary done and meta-analysis done in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
These are all very substantial results, especially within the field of language. So there we go. Okay, so to remind the audience, phonics tends to sit around an effect size in the literature of 0.45. So you can see all of these studies showed a higher result than phonics, with the exception of element, which sounds awesome. But the way I think most people are teaching vocabulary is the way that element is looking at. So it makes it less awesome than it sounds. So I'll go through that a little bit. So one of the things I want to talk about is that there's realistically 3 different ways or 4 different ways I've seen vocabulary commonly talked about being taught. And I think it's important to look at these before we go any further. So the first way I see, most commonly way seeing people teach it, is through memorization. You have words that you think are important for students to learn for whatever reason or another, and you teach them directly and you hope the students memorize the words. This is, and we see this a lot with sight words, for example, and I put in that quotations, this Dr. Timothy Shanahan recently pointed out in a blog. Sight words is kind of a misconnotation. What people really mean when they say sight words is high frequency, irregularly spelled words. And there's about 100 words that make up 50% of all written text in the English language. So that if we can teach our students these 100 words, then it really can make reading possibly much easier, because it's only 100 words. So, and this is, of course, leads to the criticism of whole language, though, because the whole point of phonics is getting kids away from learning, just trying to memorize all the words in the English language, because we have about 20,000 words that are commonly used, and you cannot possibly, as a teacher, teach your students 20,000 words. But we could reasonably, I think it's fair and reasonable to say we can teach the 100 that are really commonly used. I would personally advocate we teach those after we've taught phonics, though, because I think teaching phonics would make it easier. Now, I've heard some people advocate that we should teach those irregular words, those 100 words, whatever you want to call them, your sight words, your adult sight words, your high frequency words, whatever you want to call them. Some people advocate that we teach them through phonics also, because you can technically still decode them. It's just they're a little trickier to decode. You know, for example, the E is making that sound, and the TH is making the sound. So you can still decode the word and help students decode it. But it's not necessarily as easy as decoding something like cat. So there's a little bit of a debate. Another one that I've seen really popularly talked about lately is heart words. Yeah. And that's where we put little hearts over the parts of the words that are irregular or more challenging to decode. I think this is a nice idea. But I've never seen a single study of it. So I can't.
I'll send you one.
Oh, did you? Okay.
I will.
Oh, you will. Okay. It's definitely not addressed on like a meta-analysis level. So even if we have a study or 2 on it, I feel like we have to temper our conviction of it. It's with like any strategy. You know, if we only have a small number of studies, I think we can't come out and say, well, this is like the best way to teach something. We can say this is a possible way. It could work. It might even be the best way, but we just don't have the evidence yet to prove that. Another way that I've seen vocabulary really talked about being taught is via morphology. And I thought this is a really compelling way to teach vocabulary personally, because the English language is primarily a morphological language. The reason we have irregularly spelled words is because the language is morphologically based and not phonetically based.
Well, it's morphophonemic, so morphemes take priority over phonemes. And also the the etymology and where the words come into play, right?
Yeah, and morphology by its nature is focused on meaning, and a lot of what we're talking about in vocabulary instruction is the meaning of the words, not just recognizing them by sight. Although, like I said, there seems to be people are using different definitions within the literature. So sometimes you see people talking about word ID as vocabulary, and sometimes they mean word meaning. But morphology sort of addresses all of that beautifully. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to show high efficacy in the literature on vocabulary outcomes. So my bias when I first started to look at this was to say, oh, it makes the most sense to teach vocabulary through morphology. But we don't see that panning out. And this is a secondary meta-analysis I conducted on morphology outcomes. And I think you and I talked about maybe doing a morphology episode at some point. So
yes.
I won't go too in depth with this, but this is basically, I took all of the morphology meta-analysis that have been currently done, and I took an average result for all of the possible outcomes for each thing. And you'll notice vocabulary is quite the low number, or specifically for comprehension, I should say, actually, it's only 0.18. So that's not a particularly compelling argument in that sense. Although I do think morphology is useful. And I do think there's a compelling argument to be made for it. I just don't think it's for the sake of comprehension. This was a really interesting meta-analysis on the topic. This was my favorite one done. And this was looking at, I believe for the most part, just directly teaching the words and having students try and memorize them. And they looked at a couple of different things. And one of the things I really wanted to point out was the effect size for teaching this to dyslexic students or at-risk students is really high. And in fact, it's higher than the effect size found in the literature for phonics. And this is something I noticed that across multiple studies, we saw this idea that vocabulary instruction was particularly important for dyslexic students. And the author of this paper particularly put out the explanation that they thought it was about lowering the cognitive demands for the student by giving them, those 100 words that they're going to make up 50% of the text and allowing them to learn those words to automaticity. It made it easier to access the meaning behind the rest of the text, which I thought was a really interesting explanation. And I believe you said something similar about repeated reading last time we talked. And another really interesting thing here is how they looked at implicit versus explicit instruction. Now, when they say implicit instruction, what they're really referring to is basically silent reading, giving the kids a book and telling them to go practice reading on their own. They showed just giving kids a book and having them practice reading did have high outcomes, but it was much higher if we gave them explicit instruction and we specifically taught them individual words. But we had the highest results when we combined the two strategies together. So when we both gave students reading practice and when we explicitly taught them words. And I think that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, but then when you look at doing the at-risk learner, you have to consider the Matthew effect that we're seeing, right? So when you have an at-risk learner who is poor reader, so they're reading texts at a lower level that don't have the same vocabulary exposure. So they require that explicit vocabulary instruction to have exposure to the words that they're not reading during their silent reading time, that they're not getting just implicitly through exposure to the text, because a lower grade level text does not have the same vocabulary and they're not able to pick it up. And that's especially what we see as they progress through school.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to mention about the study, because it bleeds into the next study I'm going to talk about, is that vocabulary instruction was particularly, this meta-analysis, I'm losing my mind. This meta-analysis specifically looking at K to grade 3. And I think that's a really important thing to note, because I think we can make some assumptions about how this works in later grades based on the next one. One thing I want to point out is that the difference between the standardized test and the non-standardized test is really high. This is common in research. Using a non-standardized test almost always increases the scores. And generally speaking, I'm not a fan of looking at studies that use non-standard tests because they're almost always inflated. So we can see that this is clearly inflating our results here. But even if we look at this result for standardized tests, this is still really high. It's still higher than the impact we see for teaching phonics.
Well, and the thing you need to consider with the standardized and the non-standardized is the biases of the standardized tests that don't exist in the, or hopefully won't be the same factor in the non-standardized tests, like the cultural biases. And when you look at the different standardized tests, there definitely are cultural biases that come into play. So students from different language backgrounds may not, and cultural backgrounds may not have the same exposure to the words that are in the tests that they're going for.
I would assume that the big reason why we see higher results on non-standardized tests is because it's easier for the research team to teach to the test on a non-standard assessment. If they're making the assessment, you would think that the assessment is going to be close to what they're instructing. So I would think that would be the reason, but I do agree with your point. And then we could see clearly here that there was a higher effect for receptive vocabulary versus expressive vocabulary with vocabulary instruction, but both showed significant effects. And then the last thing I'm going to say about this meta-analysis here was the difference between RCT results and quasi. Now, this is just a nerd coming up to talk about this for a second, because one of the things that we often see is the reasons why people advocate against looking at quasi-experimental data, which is non-randomized results or non-randomized samples. They still claim that quasi-experimental study results are inflated. But here we see this, the RCT studies actually had higher results than the quasi-experimental. And the morphology meta-analysis by Dr. Pete Bowers actually had the same phenomenon happen. And that's just the nerd in me just wants to point that out so that people know you can't just immediately dismiss all quasi-experimental data. Sorry, random rant over. So this is the one that I thought, this is something I thought was really interesting, was the vocabulary instruction for struggling readers overall. So the element one, I'm going to start talking about the element one. Actually, I should say first. I'm jumping all over the place. You can tell I'm tired. It's long day at work. So the element meta-analysis showed really low results. And I'm going to go back to show you. So they showed this 0.1 result. And what the element meta-analysis did differently than the other meta-analyses was it specifically looked at K to 12. So it looked at much older grades than the other meta-analyses. And it looked at only comprehension. So the meaning of words. And they were specifically looking at studies that focused on teaching content-based words. Now, this is something that I've seen really advocated as of late by specific phonics programs. I won't name anyone here, but that this is the most important way to teach vocabulary. But it seems that we do not have strong evidence for teaching vocabulary in older grades, specifically for content knowledge, at least not on a systematic level. I am sure that when you start a new unit of a history class or a science class or a math class, it makes sense to give those content words and their definitions. But I don't know that I don't know if we have evidence within the scientific literature that it makes sense to make that like a systematic focus of your approach as a teacher, where you're always thinking about your next vocabulary list and the meaning behind those words and the knowledge. So again, this is the only one we have for older students. So it's tough. It's difficult to know if the reason the element meta-analysis showed lower results because it was content focused, or if it was because it was comprehension focused, or if it was because K to 12, and we had some high school studies in there and high school students showed lower results. But where we had the lower lower grade fluency focused vocabulary studies, we had really high results. And another thing I want to really point out about this is that the Marilla's meta-analysis showed that we had the highest results with very few lessons. So they showed 5 lessons in vocabulary outperformed 18 lessons in vocabulary. And what I think that means is it's not like phonics. Like, I think you should probably spend a year or 2, possibly longer, depending on your students, directly, systematically, explicitly teaching phonics. We don't seem to see the same value of teaching vocabulary. My guess at looking at these studies is where we see the biggest bang for our buck with vocabulary instruction is teaching the sight words over a small number of lessons, trying to help the students memorize them, and then moving on. Although, again, like I started to point out here, we see also really specifically a strong value for teaching vocabulary to students with dyslexia or reading difficulties. So I think it might make sense that students who have dyslexia, they might take longer to learn those vocabulary words. It might be that it takes, if you have working memory problems, teaching those sight words might be a slower, longer process than it is for teaching them to say your average student. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Garforth? I feel like this is the part where I said the really controversial stuff, but somebody somewhere is going to be upset at me for a second.
Well, I'm thinking about your 5 versus 18 lessons, and sitting and going through a drill deck of sight cards or practicing rote memorization of these words is not going to help make it so it's an expressive vocabulary word. You don't want to create parrots that can just recite a definition from the back of the card, because that's not giving them context and how to use it. And so we need to make sure that when we're teaching and speaking to these students, we're using those high content words so they can see and hear the word in natural speech, in natural context and learning. We have to remember that our brains are hardwired for learning spoken language. And the best way that we do this is through experiential learning. So I'm not saying we want an inquiry-based approach to vocabulary and just leave it to osmosis through being in a language-rich environment. We definitely do need to keep the vocabulary instruction and have that explicit nature, but make sure we're using it. Because the amount of vocabulary our students can be picking up just through exposure is incredible. And if we speak to them at that higher level, like I remember learning reverse peristalsis in grade 5 for vomiting. And it was super cool, but we all started using it instead of, oh, he's puking. Oh, he's reverse peristalsising. And it just heightens things. And it's having the expectation that we don't need to use the baby talk.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And that was something I was trying to get across. Like, I'm not saying that you should never teach vocabulary in a grade 12 classroom. On the contrary, I am 100% certain, as someone who used to teach grade 12, you have to teach vocabulary at a grade 12 class. But would I have like my grade 12 vocabulary unit planned, or like be like, today is my vocabulary unit lesson in a grade 12 classroom? No, I don't think that makes sense, at least based off my current reading of the scientific literature.
Well, that's where you see the implicit teaching occurring, right? Where it happens naturally within the lessons when things come up, like say you're reading a novel aloud or some context in class, and you come across a word and you discuss its meaning and you discuss its use, and you give the examples. Maybe you do the structured word inquiry or looking into the etymology of the word if you're wondering why it's spelled a certain way. And having that in context, I think, is better than just saying, okay, today we're learning these 25 words.
Yeah.
It's not going to help. And, copying out the definition from the back of a glossary in the textbook's not going to get you anywhere.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And it's funny because I feel like I've been this person who's been promoting the systematic, explicit instruction of certain things for so long. And when you get to a piece where you're like, I think we should probably at a certain point use an implicit instruction model for this, people are probably looking at me like, who is this person? Why is he saying this to me now? He's betrayed me. But I think I don't see any evidence that this is a high yield strategy past grade 3. But again, I think what you're saying makes total sense, that I completely agree with you, that we want to be using sophisticated vocabulary in our own speech and our own language in the class. And then when you have those moments where kids like, hey, what does that word mean? Or you're reading to something to the class, or you're doing a history note to the class, and they come across a word where you're like, they're not going to know what this means. Take the time to explain that to the class. But I wouldn't be like at the end of, I definitely wouldn't have like Friday as vocabulary day or something, or like, this is my vocabulary lesson plan.
Well, and the thing is, I love the word matrices that you can work on with morphology lessons. And I know that we're going to be talking about it later at some point. But focusing on one of those a week, right? Spending 20 minutes on it going through the different ways that you can form words. I don't think I have an example right here. Let me just check. Yeah, it's not handy. But looking at those and seeing how you can build the words and having that morpheme lesson within your instruction and then going on, right? And it could be a word that you discover as you're reading, right? Especially in, the science, the humanities, where you have those words that have that Greek and Latin base, right? Showing them how to build words, but not having that the focus for weeks on end. And just doing it, once a week, once every 2 weeks. These are the ones that we're doing, and just having it there so that they can see it. But I think the big thing that we need to highlight as far as the implicit learning versus the explicit learning is that language is a natural process. Learning language. Whereas learning reading and learning the complex mathematics, that's not hardwired in the brain or pre-wired, right? But we've been using spoken language for centuries, and that region is.
I agree with everything that you're saying, which is nice. It's nice when you agree with people, especially when they're very smart, like Dr. Kathryn Garforth. But I feel bad coming onto this episode because, I feel like normally I'm like armed to the teeth with these piles of research. And I just felt like there wasn't enough research on this specific topic to really give people what they would want to know.
But that's part of understanding the process and understanding the science of reading or structured literacy is right now, there is no solid, this is how you have to teach vocabulary. We recognize it's a very important part of learning and having our students build that vocabulary so that they can understand what's going on, and recognizing that the students that aren't having the same exposure to printed text aren't getting it because our spoken language realistically in everyday conversation doesn't contain these words. And we have the exposure when we're reading to it. And that's, the huge thing about reading to kids aloud. Well, it's not going to teach them how to read, but it's going to help them a lot with their vocabulary, like the books like the Fancy Nancy books. I know your little one's a little bit young for those ones, but the children's storybooks is filled with this amazing vocabulary and paints the pictures in the mind. You don't get that from sitting in front of a television because you're seeing the environment, you're having to deduce the emotion. But when you're reading it in printed text, it's important. And that's why I always advocate for reading aloud to your class K to 12. Mm-hmm. I think that is essential because you can have those teachable moments where you work the vocabulary in. You can expose them to books that they likely wouldn't have chosen themselves and can get enjoyment. That's the importance of a rich language arts curriculum. And in the higher grades, having the exposure to things like poetry and Shakespeare, where that language that's used is very different from our everyday spoken language.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although I'm very anti-Shakespeare, but I won't get into that debate.
It was just an example. I'm not saying everybody.
That's why I said I won't get into that debate.
Yeah.
But I agree with you, and I also think that we have this whole growing movement around the science of reading and growing crowd, and I feel like I've been reading and writing about the science of reading for the last several years, but I'm scared of people oversimplifying the science. Because I feel like there are these things in the science that are so well established, like repeated reading, like phonics, like explicit systematic instruction, that I feel like it's super easy to be like, yes, this is the answer. We know this for sure. And there's all these things on the peripherals that we either have some research confirming might be true, or are just theories that people have come up with that could be true, and who knows. I feel like it's almost tough to be like, hey, we can't look at everything in the exact same light. We have to realize that science is an evolving thing. It's an evolving literature. And there might be things we end up being wrong about in this community in the long run. And there might be things that we're right about very solidly yet, and we don't know. And I think it's important to just speak in terms of degrees of probability because it is a science, And I see that a lot in other fields where, people be like, according to the evidence, this is my best understanding, or this is what the evidence seems to suggest, not this is fact, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and I think it's important to also note, especially when we're looking at vocabulary, there are so many external factors that come into play, such as the individual's exposure to the language, whether they're learning English as a first or second, third, fourth language, the vocabulary in their environment, the culture, the way that language is spoken, the syntax, where they are in their language learning journey plays a big role. And, every area has their little colloquialisms, right? And the way that you go about saying things. And I can't remember if it was a conversation with you, but it was with Cheryl Urbanchek about culture, and talking about how when you have multilingual individuals and the way that you say things changes. Like apparently, I know that in Greek, when you're talking about turning off the light, is shut the light. And apparently that's very common for many of the Mediterranean languages. You're saying shut the light. And then, so having the individual learn that, no, it's yes, conceptually it makes sense, but we talk about turning off the light instead of shutting it.
Yeah. With this, I put out an article about this recently where I tried to go through the most pertinent research, and I really wanted to answer the question, what is better, heart words, rote memorization, advanced phonics, for lack of a better term, or morphology for teaching these words that students often struggle with. And I feel like I didn't have an answer, because there really is very limited research, especially comparing different strategies like that. So it's really hard to say. So right now, when it comes to you have to sort of differentiate between vocabulary meaning and vocabulary fluency. I guess I'm really more referring to vocabulary fluency here, but when it comes to vocabulary fluency, I don't have any best practice other than you should do it for a short period of time in the primary years, and you should do it when you have students who are behind in reading and struggling. But I'm perfectly comfortable saying, it's your preference if you teach it morphology based, or if you teach it phonics based, or if you teach it rote memorization based, because we don't have strong evidence one way or the other.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the key thing that we're talking about, the difference between expressive and receptive vocabulary and words that have been orthographically mapped or added to the sight word vocabulary, where they can instantly recognize them within a fraction of a second. And those have very different implications. One has to do with oral communication and comprehension, and then one has to do with reading fluency. And I think it's important to separate those two, because there are students, I'm not saying that assistive technology is the end all be all and the solution to students who struggle with reading. But while we're still working on building up that word recognition skill, we still have to expand their vocabulary beyond words that they can decode and add to their sight word vocabulary. So, I mean, the problem that we have here is overlapping terms.
Oh, for sure.
And not having a clear understanding of the object of the lesson. So if we're looking at adding the word to the sight word vocabulary so the student can instantly recognize it within a fraction of a second when they're reading it, which is a very important skill. That's what we want for fluent readers who can comprehend the text. A lot of those 100 words, they already have the vocabulary to use them and can use them correctly in speech. They just can't read them. But we need to continue to work on those words that are in the academic language and in the written language, the rich vocabulary that's going to heighten their comprehension of texts. And that takes a different approach than it does for reading. If that makes sense.
No, I totally agree with you. And well, I felt like there was even less research on that sort of meaning-based comprehension, that sort of, as you call it, receptive vocabulary. I felt like there was even less on that. So I other than the literature doesn't seem to show a high benefit to teaching it systematically, I didn't have an answer. So that's why I tend to agree with you. Like, I could see it as a teacher for my own personal anecdotal experience that, yes, students do need that vocabulary taught to them. And yes, I agree that possibly an implicit way of doing it works best or makes the most logical sense, but I don't have a good answer based on the scientific literature.
Well, but there's also, when you're doing that explicit instruction of vocabulary for receptive vocabulary and expressive vocabulary, which words do you choose, right? You have to think of the context and the student's needs in the situation that you're in. Because if you teach, words that they are only going to come across in Jane Austen or Machiavelli, Socrates, yes, that expands their vocabulary, but how much of an impact is it going to have on their life? Yeah.
And then another thing I think to think about too is actually, we were talking about the difference between standardized and non-standardized assessments. This is an area actually where I will admit maybe it makes less sense to use a standardized assessment, because how sensitive is that standardized test going to be to the instruction?
Well, and that's what I was talking about earlier is, when it's very hard to measure vocabulary instruction on a standardized test, because if the word that you are teaching is not on the standardized test, you're not going to measure. But they could have added 200 words to their vocabulary, just not the ones focused on that standardized test. And, having that non-standardized test saying, okay, well, we're going to do a unit focusing on, I don't know, anatomy, right? Human anatomy of the hand. And the hundreds of bones in there. Well, doing a vocabulary test on, I don't know, a combustion engine, when you're teaching the anatomy of the hand, they're both scientific concepts that have their own unique vocabulary and understanding, but you're not going to get the same results, right?
Yeah. No, that's a really good point.
So, and then we see things like the baseball study, right? And this is a great example of having that background knowledge and that vocabulary helps with comprehension. And so you see poor readers that are very good at baseball already having the vocabulary and the knowledge about the subject. So even though they didn't have the skills to read the text, they could answer the questions correctly. Whereas a student that was a skilled reader but didn't know a thing about baseball couldn't. They answered some, but they didn't do as well as the students that had that knowledge and that vocabulary going into the story.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of the classic criticism of IQ tests too, right? Is that lack of cultural knowledge can create cultural biases on the IQ tests. Although I do believe modern IQ tests are more corrected for this problem. Well, that's a whole other can of worms. I hate IQ tests. Sorry, whole other can of worms. I'm not going to talk about why I hate IQ tests on this episode.
Yeah. Wonderful. So do you have any other thoughts about vocabulary that you think we need to mention?
I don't. And I feel bad for that. But
no,
I feel like the literature is less complete on this topic than it is other topics. So it's hard to speak with great conviction. That makes sense.
Well, and it's important for everyone to understand that. Like, you're not going to have this, here's your vocabulary curriculum and it's the best way to do it, and you're going to have this amazing results. You need to figure out how to make sure that your students are getting that exposure to the words that they need to add to their vocabulary in a meaningful way, so that they can go away from just reciting a definition that's not really meaningful to actually using that word in a variety of settings and contexts, so that it becomes part of their vocabulary.
Yeah, I think it's funny if you could read a phonics curriculum, look at it and say, well, this phonics curriculum doesn't look very good based off what we know from the scientific literature. I don't think you can look at a vocabulary curriculum and say, I don't think this looks good, or at least not with great ease.
Well, I'm sure there's some that you can say, well, don't bother with that one, but you can't say this is the one to use.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Nate. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And tomorrow we're talking about the research behind comprehension,
which is also muddy. So your viewers are not going to come out feeling like they know everything for sure. But I think it's important to understand too, as you said, when the literature is less specific, so that we sort of have to temper our confidences a little.
Exactly. Have a great day, and make sure that you like and follow the Right to Read initiative on our various social media platforms, and subscribe to the Right to Read podcast. Take care.